that Rachel was, at least we knew, because Rachel this was extremely painful for her, and she knew there was something going on before she was ever diagnosed. She knew. And so I think once they diagnosed her and started taking her seriously and her pain seriously, it was a bit of a relief for Rachel to finally get treated, and treated like she mattered, and treated like someone who wasn't exaggerating or looking for pain meds. And all this whole time, I'm desperate to see her fall asleep, because it had been, at this point, over a week and a half without sleep, with her just in pain all the time. So I remember she was diagnosed on January 5th, and they ordered the chemo right away. They wanted her transferred to the UMass campus that was up the street, Lake Ave, the bigger campus where they have the school in Worcester, UMass Memorial. And they wanted to start her on chemo right away, a real heavy, intense chemo. And they wanted to give her first chemo infusion in the hospital so they could monitor her, and she was getting 5-FU, irinotecan, oxaliplatin, and the 5-FU is, I think it's fluorouracil, but all of those combined, which are it's like one of the heaviest chemo cocktails you can get. Surprisingly, you don't experience hair loss. She didn't experience hair loss, thank God. But that first night, that first infusion, man, God, it was hard. It was brutal. The night that she got a diagnosis, they made her comfortable. We slept in Belmont campus. And the next morning, she got transferred. But at this point, I had set up lights in her room, because we had moved in, and brought all sorts of comforts for her and stuff. So when she got transferred, she left in a wheelchair, and I stayed in the Belmont room to gather our stuff and follow her. And I was rushing because I didn't want her to be alone, and she didn't want to be alone. And I remember getting there, and she was still in the hallway and hadn't gotten a room yet. And then finally they brought her up. She got her own room. This is a much nicer hospital, and she got wheeled in. It was a single room, and that afternoon they began the process of informing her of what the kind of chemo she was going to get. They did, I remember she had it's like we were all talking in this big room, and she met her doctor, her oncologist, Dr. Ali. Brilliant young woman, just a brilliant oncologist, who, in hindsight, I think I think you want to move and go to Dana-Farber, and sometimes I wish that we did that earlier, so they would have found maybe a clinical trial or something. But I think Dr. Ali's, I think she was the one. She was the one. She's a very good doctor, but she explained to us what the chemo was, how intense it was, and the complications and everything. And meanwhile, Rachel's still in pain and just wants... None of the pain medicines were doing anything for her, so Rachel was excited to take her first chemo infusion, because Dr. Ali explained to us that the first infusion the first few infusions do the most damage to the tumor. And as far as pain management goes, there was nothing that was going to relieve her pain other than to kill some of that tumor mass and shed some of those cells that were pushing up against the lining of her colon. So but that first infusion that night was one of the worst nights of my... This was just one of the worst nights I can remember. we found out that Rachel had an allergic reaction to oxaliplatin immediately. Her face swelled. First of all, what they do is before they give you the chemo, especially something that strong, they pump Rachel full of hormones. I remember exactly why, but they pump her full of hormones, I guess because it wipes out her hormones when they give her the chemo. So before the infusion, she gets dosed up with all these hormones, certain steroids to reduce swelling. But the first thing she gets is the oxaliplatin, and it sometimes causes an allergic reaction. Like her throat started to close, her eyes started to swell, a lot like I was deadly allergic to peanuts as a kid. I carried around EpiPen, and I could see that she was having the same kind of allergic reaction. And not only that, she had just been told she has terminal cancer. She's having her first infusion immediately after, the next day, of this insanely intense cocktail of chemo. She hasn't slept in days, and she's been in pain, nonstop pain. And then they shoot her up with all these hormones. So you have all these emotions going on. And when these hormones kicked in, man, and then the oxaliplatin caused that allergic reaction, Rachel was miserable. Plus we did not have a good nurse that night. I hate to say anything bad about any nurse, but all of our nurses were fine. But it just wasn't a right fit for Rachel for her first infusion, and it was the worst. It was awful for her. The pain of having a tumor in your colon, just imagine the kind of things, that kind of blockages that can cause. And then the allergic reaction from the oxaliplatin, the hormones, the nausea, it was shell shock. Just a dreadful night. We're up all night. And the reason why I'm casting this morning, as I look outside and I see the sun, the dark sky start to lighten up a little bit, is because it reminds me of 2017, that January morning. Because when the sun came out, after all she had been through, up all night with the doubled over in pain and crying, and both of us just a mess, just trying to get her through every minute by minute with that first infusion. Finally, something happened. They changed nurses. They gave her Benadryl, a lot of Benadryl, to combat the allergic reaction from the oxali. They slowed down the rate of infusion by a lot. She was scheduled to have a 72-hour infusion, like max 72-hour, and they slowed it down even more because it was just too much for her. And I remember when the sun came up, just coming up, still awake. She's finally in the bed that's comfortable, and mind you, I hadn't seen her sleep in a long time, and it was really bothering me. And I hadn't slept very well, but more than anything, after a week, 2 weeks, I don't even know, it could have been a month. Because I remember that Thanksgiving she was in the hospital too, back and forth. So it was over a month at this point where Rachel was in a ton of pain and hadn't slept well. To look over and finally, after a night of a horrible infusion, she's still hooked up to the pump. I think they do the oxaliplatin, the irinotecan, and then the last 2 days is the 5-FU, the fluorouracil. I mean, don't quote me. I think that's it. And I remember the sun coming up, and I looked over, and Rachel had fallen asleep. She had her little hat on. She was tucked in. Finally got comfortable and fell asleep, and she had a little smile on. And that was one of the best mornings. Just finally she had some relief. She had fallen asleep and not just falling asleep in like a sweaty mess or something. She fell into a peaceful sleep. I don't think Rachel knew how to sleep unless it was peaceful. She could crash through a tornado, and whenever she was sleeping, she always looked just, yeah. She always just looked just perfect when she was sleeping. But to see her fall asleep that morning, what a relief. What a relief. I remember laying down. I had a cot too up against the wall. And I remembered, yeah. We had a very nice morning, just resting, first time ever. And she slept pretty good for the following 48 hours. She remained peaceful. Started to get her will and her drive back a little bit. It was finally the pressure of that tumor. She could feel the relief. She knew that the chemo was doing something. And yeah, and this morning that's what I thought of when I woke up. Look outside. Especially these winter mornings, we spent a lot of time in the hospital during like winter. Another time that reminds me of our last hospital stay, she was there for a long time, was when it was starting to become spring, like February, late February, early March-ish, and it reminds me also, these things stick in your brain, like these moments. Yeah, up until that point, I hadn't really had anything that was like this concrete thing that stuck in my brain, like moments of pride or whatever. Everybody has moments that they like to hold on to and moments they like to forget. And I don't think I had many. Well, that's a lie. There were tons of moments I like to forget as a youngster when I was going through my crap, but no real moments of like having seen, like, I don't know how to say this without sounding cheesy, but I hadn't experienced anything that made me, like, formulated my spirit as far as what my beliefs are in God. But, the whole experience for both of us was really spiritual. It was just a really, I don't want to say it was spiritual, because then you think of, there's all sorts of like associations you have with that word, but I think the whole experience for Ray and I both was revealing, like, especially for me, because she had faith and she really did believe. But I was more doubtful than she was until this whole experience, and and now it's 2 years since that day have passed. 2 years since she was first diagnosed, and it'll be 2 years in April for the anniversary of her passing. And I'll tell you right now, I don't have any doubts anymore. That year and a half, that period that we went through, just, yeah, it, let's just say it dissolved my doubt as far as whether I think God exists. But just strange, because you'd think, when I tell people that, sometimes they think, oh, that's strange. You'd think he'd have more doubt, because you know, if there is a God, there's